How much do you think firmware security has improved in the last 15 years? Would you believe not at all?
Matt, you picked up a story about the progress we're making in firmware, right?
So it's more of a story about the progress we're not making in firmware. I think that's a more accurate way of saying it. So Sarah Zatko and her team at the Cyber Independent Testing Lab released some information at a sort of a talk during DEF CON and Black Hat time in Las Vegas, Hewlett Foundation. And the gist of the data that they were able to come up with is that firmware security is really not where it ought to be, and no real progress has been made in the last couple of years either. So what they did is they took a whole bunch of different firmware binaries, around 6,000 versions, and they said about 3 million binaries, give or take. And they ran automatic code analysis against them just to see if the common sorts of defenses you might put in when you're writing code are there. Actually, it's more accurate to say the kinds of defenses you might put in when you're compiling code. Because when you write code, a lot of the compilers that you can choose will have features that they can automatically add to the code for you. Things like data execution prevention, or non-executable stacks, address space layout randomization, a long list of things that a compiler can automatically add to your code to make it harder to exploit the code, to sort of move things around, make it much more difficult for an attacker to write a reliable exploit against this firmware.
Okay.
Which you would think is something that is, pretty easy to do, and for the payout you get, you may as well be doing it.
Network devices, you expect there to be some level of an attempt to be secure, and when research shows that it doesn't appear that we're even trying, it's kind of concerning and surprising to me, at least. Is it that they're patching for known things but not innovating? That's kind of the way it seems to me. They're not kind of doing anything to get out ahead of security issues, but there is some reactionary.
I would say that they're simply not doing it, and I don't think that they're even getting out ahead of anything. If anything, the data shows negligible changes between the start of the measurement period and the end of the measurement period. And this is across like 18 different vendors.
Wow.
When we talk about vulnerabilities, though, we should be clear. The way that they tested this was only limited to the sorts of things they could do at scale. We're talking, 3 million samples here. They couldn't look for, say, stored passwords in each one because they'd have to hunt and peck and find how those passwords were stored, or they didn't find actual vulnerabilities. What they did look for was whether or not the code had the characteristics that would indicate that a certain protection was built in during compilation.
Okay.
Is a very important difference there, because they're not actually like trying to find vulnerabilities. They're trying to find the sort of things that you would compile in if you were compiling for a desktop or another more, and I hate to say more mature platform, because again, firmware isn't a new thing. It's just that it seems that all the stuff that we would normally do compiling for desktops or laptops or other non-IoT platforms are simply not being done. I think that's the gist of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the article comments just in general how kind of from the bottom up there's issues going back to the curriculum when you're taught maybe that low-level programming, how to put some of these protections in, even just simple, compile flags, right? So it almost seems like maybe there's not the standard coding practices where organizations require or recommend that you use certain compile flags, which I think they commented would address a lot of these vulnerabilities.
I mean, is this surprising to you guys, or do you think this is just sort of to be expected?
I think I'm more used to hearing about firmware vulnerabilities from an actual vulnerability standpoint, like someone finds one or a handful at a time. And I kind of assumed that some work had gone into creating these exploits against the vulnerabilities. I hadn't really considered the fact that these sorts of defenses hadn't been put in place, because let's be fair, some of these things you can get around. You can get around DEP, you can get around ASLR certain ways. But I was kind of expecting that some of these things would have been put in. Maybe that's just me, though.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, you're a developer. Do you think this could maybe go back to sort of how unexciting refactoring your code is. You know, like we have a piece of code that works, and a lot of times you inherit it from somebody. You know, the refactoring and adding new flags, that's not the most exciting work. Do you think that's kind of, this is sort of like a grand scale example of that?
Yeah, I mean, it could be a few things. I mean, this is obviously, we think about the stack, and we tend to focus on vulnerabilities like, up the stack, right? This is really low-level programming. You're getting down, you're interfacing with hardware, and, you're writing typically things in C or assembly, and like Matt said, those compile options are important. So you always understand not just what you're doing, but what's the best way that you can add these protections. I mean, we hear a lot about like hard-coded passwords when we think about some of these lower-level vulnerabilities, but it's a bigger problem of just understanding, when you're developing that low, exactly what you're doing and what are kind of the best practices that you really need to be thinking about.
Yeah. Cool. Interesting. I mean, yeah, I think a lot of it is just sort of, the mentality of you programming. It's what's new and flashy, and if there's stuff that's low-level assembly, that's probably I could see how something needs to break before it gets fixed, because it shouldn't be, but I could see that.
The way I see it is more like there's always going to be some adversary who's better at doing what they do than you are at defending, and that's fine. I get that. You're still striving to do your best. But silly things like to use a metaphor, you leave the house, you lock the door, or you're driving in the car and you wear a seatbelt. These are things that you should be doing sort of instinctively or without a second thought. You put the locks on things and you make sure that you remember to lock them. Does that prevent someone from breaking into your house? Not necessarily, but at least it raises the bar a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it probably also speaks to the testing and red teaming, that kind of, internal, taking a look at what you're prepared for, right?
I think if you're a developer and you have the ability to use the secure flags that are available to you, enabling ASLR and DEP and other things that have been around for a long time from a desktop, laptop, regular like x86 environment sort of standpoint, you should already be compiling with these flags if you're writing code.